Red 2 standing by, all four lit and in the green. Our mission today is Goldeneye. The Nintendo 64 classic finally came to Switch Online, and this is a big opportunity for me to share a hell of a lot of information about one of my favourite franchises of all time. There's going to be a lot of information which will be the main source of... Why is it doing that? It will be the main source of commentary and information. So I'll be providing that as sort of post-commentary, and I'll also provide any additional comments on a sort of sidebar which you can sort of see, well, on the screen at the moment. It's going to be a bit fiddly, there's going to be a lot to talk about, so I'm going to go through each mission on Agent, Secret Agent, and 00 Agent, and then, if I haven't already got the levels cheat, I'm going to try for that. Because we have 23 different cheats. Some of them are actually unlocked by completing certain difficulty levels. The rest are earned by completing each level within a certain time on a specific difficulty. And some of them get really, really tough. Some of them are very easy. So, our very first mission kicks us off basically where the movie begins. And I apologize for the pronunciation. The Bielormorye Dam in Arkhangelsk in the USSR in 1986. It's nearly 30 years since the movie came out. It makes me feel a bit old. But let's get right to it. As I said, I'll be playing through each difficulty setting. We'll have a little bit of information in the sidebar, and I'm going to kick off this episode and all my knowledge about the James Bond series. Yes, this is going to be a factual series, as well as watching me show off why I graduated from the Imperial Stormtrooper Marksmanship Academy. But yeah, we'll be kicking things off with a biography of Ian Fleming, the man who made all this possible. So, I'll start off on Agent, then move to Secret and 00. So, this gives us our primary objectives. You can go straight into the mission, or you can flick through the folders for information. So, Mission 1, Arkhangelsk, Part 1, Dam. Background. MI6 has confirmed the existence of a secret chemical warfare facility at the Bielormorye Dam, USSR. Its heavily guarded location and workings are a cause for major concern. Nerve gas produced there has been turning up in the hands of hostile regimes around the world, and deals with international terrorists have been rumoured. This facility should be destroyed with extreme prejudice. We'll get briefings from M, information from Q, and little comments from Moneypenny along the way. There was very much a changing of the guard as the world changed in the aftermath of the Cold War's end. The area around the dam is well defended against full-scale military attack, but a lone agent stands a much better chance. The easiest way to gain entrance to the weapons factory will be to get down the face of the dam. Q had an idea about that. Information concerning shipping and contacts are stored on a computer system in a secret ops room within the dam. With this covert modem connected to their satellite link, we can intercept the data when a backup is carried out. As for getting down the dam, use the bungee rope. At the bottom of the jump, use the piton gun. Simple. Interestingly enough, you don't actually use those in the game, but you do see Bond using them in the movie. It's mentioned in John Gardner's novelization, which I will bring up from time to time. I told you I'm taking this very seriously. That, if everything went wrong, it would have been very, very dangerous, very, very painful, and Bond would have wound up very, very dead. Fortunately, it all worked. Hardly a lover's leap, James. Be careful though, I hate to think of you falling for anyone else. Usually a few cheesy puns, so I can appreciate that. Now, let's get going on the basic difficulty. The following information has been sourced from Andrew Lycett's biography of Ian Fleming, originally published in 1995, and Fergus Fleming's collection of Ian's letters, The Man with the Golden Typewriter. And that isn't actually a Bond reference. Ian did actually purchase a gold typewriter after the success of Casino Royale. Anyway, let's begin. Ian Lancaster Fleming was born on May 28, 1908, to Valentine and Evelyn Fleming. His birth was almost a year to the day after his brother Peter, who would ultimately go on to be an accomplished writer in, dare I say it, his own right. Terrible pun, really. Lycett cites Fleming's middle name as coming from his mother's insistence she was descended from John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster and fourth son of King Edward III. Valentine Fleming had worked as a banker alongside his father and also showed political ambitions, being elected as the Conservative MP for Henley in South Oxfordshire in 1910. He was a contemporary and friend of Winston Churchill and would give a speech promoting national service in 1912. Valentine himself had undertaken training in the Oxfordshire Hussars and would serve as a captain in that regiment when war broke out in August 1914. Churchill would later write an obituary when Valentine was killed in action in May 1917. At the time of his father's death, Ian and Peter were at Durnford Preparatory School, widely considered a gateway to Eton. It was here where Ian played golf for the first time, along with several other sports. He would display a keen skill in athletics throughout his time at Eton, preferring individual sports to team pursuits. By contrast, his brother Peter was a keen scholar with several academic achievements. Ian's lack of academic prowess, or at least interest therein, seems all the more unusual when one considers he did have some very keen literary interests in terms of reading and actually collecting books. Perhaps seeking to escape his brother's shadow in some way, sport became Ian's solace. He would win several athletics events over his time at Eton, including winning 6 out of 10 events in the junior section of the school sports in 1924, a feat never before achieved and never equalled since. In both 1925 and 1926, Ian was declared Victor Ludorum, or champion athlete, the first time in living memory any boy had earned this accolade in consecutive years. Despite these triumphs, Ian was not fond of his time at Eton. His mother's dismay at his academic results and decision to steer him into courses designed for establishing an army career cannot have helped. Despite this, Ian did remarkably well on the entrance examination to Sandhurst Military College, the first traces of his association with the armed forces. Literature and producing small magazines remained major interests for him, though these early works contained something of a backlash against the social circles frequented by his mother. This railing against the perceived high-class intelligentsia would be a source of friction during his marriage to Anne Rothermere later in life. While Fleming's time at Sandhurst was mostly marked by a desire to rebel against the rules, eventually dropping out due to troubles involving women, similar reasons were given for James Bond leaving his education. He would find much better influence and instruction under Ernan Forbes Dennis at a school of sorts in Kitzbühel, Austria. Bond would again parallel Fleming's life, having spent time here with a man named Hans Oberhauser after the death of his parents. Under Forbes Dennis' much more relaxed and understanding tutelage, Ian would begin to study for entry examinations to the Foreign Service at the insistence of his mother. While in Kitzbühel, Ian continued to write, often encouraged by Forbes Dennis' wife Phyllis. Only one short story, A Poor Man Escapes, survives. Characteristics of his familiar writing style can be seen within the work. Several poems, especially those dedicated to his girlfriend back in England, have also survived. Of course, having a girlfriend didn't stop Ian fooling around with local girls. As if starting to form the elements of Bond's life, he took an interest in cars around this time as well. In 1931, Ian would start work with Reuters, thanks to some connections of his mother's. She had engineered this after Ian failed to secure a job with the Foreign Office. While he achieved a passing result in the entrance examinations, only the top 3 candidates were offered jobs, and Eve was determined to expel her son's failures. She blamed his new girlfriend, a young woman named Monique, for Ian's failures. As a side note, this relationship ultimately provided Ian with the name of Bond's mother, a Swiss woman. During his tenure with Reuters, Ian would develop a keen eye for detail which would inform his work. Meticulously accurate descriptions were a key element of his stories. Bond's adventures would paint vivid pictures in the reader's minds, from the intense action to the simplest details, and even things like a well-prepared meal, even a basic breakfast eaten by Bond, can be described in lavish detail. Sadly, Ian would not spend particularly long working here. After the death of his grandfather Robert, and the reveal of a rather contentious will affecting the family, his mother would push him into a career in banking, following his father. Unlike Peter, who seemed to excel at a great range of things, Ian was not very good in the world of finance. But it was through a meeting with a man named Lancey Hugh Smith, whose family included links to the Royal Navy, that Ian would experience his first trappings of the intelligence world. When Ian finally removed himself from under his mother's thumb in 1936, his life would take on some of the elements displayed in the Bond novels in an even more serious fashion. Plenty of sex and travels to exotic locations. He would also begin to deepen his involvement with the intelligence world, taking on some freelance intelligence gathering work. Initial attempts were not particularly successful and not well regarded, but he nonetheless persisted in gathering information on both Germany and Russia. It was during these sojourns to Europe that Ian would meet Anne Rothermere for the first time, and a small affair was conducted. Ian's persistence in gathering intelligence ultimately paid off, and he was rewarded with the opportunity to meet Admiral John Godfrey, who had been recently appointed Director of Naval Intelligence. Godfrey was acquainted with the head of the Secret Intelligence Service, Admiral Sinclair, known as C in the broader intelligence circles. As you have no doubt observed, many aspects of Ian's life have informed the books. Places he visited, people he met, all sorts of little details would gradually find their way into the world of 007, and his intelligence bosses would ultimately form the character of M, who was involved in the British Navy. Ian's work in naval intelligence would impress Godfrey, and he would earn his place in both the department and the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve. He would begin with the rank of lieutenant and be promoted to commander on the 8th of September 1939, the same rank James Bond holds. It must be said though, Bond is actually granted promotion to captain in John Gardner's novels, and in this case captain is equivalent to an army colonel. Working as Godfrey's personal assistant, Ian would prove himself an extremely valuable asset in the intelligence world. He displayed a hitherto hidden sense of application and duty, working long hours and providing a number of plans for important operations, such as an attempt to block the Danube River with the intent to hinder German shipping. A number of other duties in Europe would follow until the fall of France and installation of the Vichy government, and Ian acquitted himself well in the field. However, he was largely considered a very important asset, which is why he didn't get a lot of field missions. He was too valuable to have his capture risked. When he returned to England, he would continue to try and mastermind operations for naval intelligence, including a plan to capture an Enigma decoding machine. Another operation, planned in case the Germans entered Spain, was titled Goldeneye. Taken from the novel Reflections in a Goldeneye, this name would stick with Ian for some time, as he chose it for the name of his house in Oricabessa in Jamaica. Said house was the source of this movie and game's title, naturally. A number of commando raids were planned by Fleming, including one at Dieppe which he supervised from afar. Again, I apologise for pronunciations. Those who are interested in the extensive details of the missions would actually do well to read Nicholas Rankin's book Ian Fleming's Commandos, which covers the history of his commando unit, 30 Assault Unit, and will provide much greater detail than this truncated biography of the man. It was clear Fleming was actually becoming quite a major player in the intelligence world, even if forays into the field were immensely rare. He was actually present at meetings between Churchill and Roosevelt, and had involvement in planning elements of Operation Overlord, the official name for the D-Day landings. Perhaps paralleling James Bond somewhere along the way, Fleming's legend grew to have major involvements in things like the capture of Rudolf Hess. By the end of 1945, Ian was back in the civilian world and had expressed some interest in writing books as his brother Peter had. Peter had also served in intelligence during World War II, it's worth noting. Ian's career was to be established easily, thanks to a connection with Lord Kemsley, owner of several major newspapers. Ian would become the foreign manager for Kemsley newspapers. The period of annual leave he was entitled to in this position would ultimately enable him to write his books, though this was not on his mind immediately. He would, however, spend some time constructing his house at Oricabessa, the aforementioned Goldeneye, situated at a place which meant Golden Head in Spanish. His relationship and affair with Anne Rothermere would also continue, with the two often joking about their newspaper rivalry. Kemsley's group owned the Sunday Times, which wasn't quite as important in the aftermath of World War II, while Esmond Rothermere oversaw the Daily Mail among many other papers. The Daily Mail was somewhat respectable in those days, but it never entirely escaped its reputation as the Daily Heil due to the pro-German sympathies of Rothermere's father. Ian would eventually marry Anne in early 1952 after her relationship with Esmond Rothermere ended. It is believed Anne's second pregnancy to Ian was a major reason. In this time, Anne had lost a child fathered by Ian, and Ian himself had suffered problems with chest pains which would continue to plague him throughout his later days. The impending prospect of marriage somewhat frightened Ian, however, and he decided he would finally burn off all that nervous energy and deal with the stress by writing his books at last. Anne was well involved in many literary circles and had done a significant amount of writing herself. Ian was always a bit worried about the reactions from Anne's literary friends where his works were concerned, but nonetheless, he would eventually decide to sit down and write during his periods of leave from working for Lord Kemsley's newspapers. John Pearson dates the birth of James Bond, Agent 007, as the 15th of January 1952. Ian had actually finished the first manuscript of Casino Royale by March 18th, although he would ultimately spend some time refining it. His usual process was writing 2,000 words a day, a couple of sessions split with his own relaxation pursuits such as swimming in between. Editing and refinements for each of the books would be completed upon his return to England. Of course, once he actually had the manuscript sorted out, a publisher had to be found first. Ian was finally spurred into contacting Jonathan Cape's publishing house by his friend William Plummer. The latter practically forced Cape into publishing it, as the publisher himself was noted to not be particularly fond of thrillers, and Casino Royale was actually the only James Bond novel he read. Eventually though, the book would be published, everything would be set up, and James Bond would make his societal debut on 13th April 1953, 2 days earlier than Fleming had intended. He wanted the release to be on the same day as Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. Before the publication of Casino Royale, however, Fleming had begun work on a book tentatively titled The Undertaker's Wind, after a regular breeze which blew across Jamaica. He had been informed that he should continue writing that second book and get it started before Casino Royale's publication, just in case the reviews disheartened him. The Undertaker's Wind would become known as Live and Let Die, the second James Bond novel, and Fleming would continue to show his meticulous eye for detail. His travels to America helped him accurately set the scene, and his familiarity with Jamaica assisted with the climax of the book. As the series progressed over time, film options would be discussed, but even early on these popped up here and there. A television movie of Casino Royale would actually be made in 1954, condensing the plot of the book somewhat. For example, the characters of Renee Mathis and Vesper Lind are combined into one character, Valerie Mathis. The first person to portray James Bond on screen would be an American, Barry Nelson, so there's one for the trivia buffs out there. I suppose if we're being pedantic, Bob Simmons does the gun barrel walk on in Dr. No, so he's the first person to portray James Bond on film. Other film ideas were discussed, but nothing seemed to be forthcoming despite the book's successes. After Moonraker was set in England, it's an actual rarity that a Bond adventure is largely set in England. Fleming would continue his on-point research with a trip to Las Vegas and surrounds alongside Ernest Cuneo, providing inspiration for Diamonds Are Forever. He would also do some research for a work which would ultimately be released as Thrilling Cities. It may be possible that the work done for Diamonds Are Forever also inspired Ian's non-Fleming book The Diamond Smugglers. Cuneo himself is honoured with a cameo of sorts in the novel, yet another example of Fleming drawing on his own life experiences to paint the pictures of his world. His travels to Russia earlier in his life would provide a lot of detail for From Russia with Love. His description of Smersh's headquarters is said to be quite accurate, though one must note that Smersh was merely a branch of the NKVD, essentially a predecessor to the KGB, and it disbanded in 1946. Certainly its head, General Gribozaboyshikov, did not actually exist. Perhaps that defunct status allowed it to be presented in such a fashion that all-powerful, nebulous, evil organisation working behind the scenes without really bothering the Russians too much because they essentially just had a caricature. Even as the novels proved very popular, Fleming did weary of 007 somewhat, perhaps reminiscent of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle becoming tired of Sherlock Holmes, or Agatha Christie no longer wishing to write stories of Hercule Poirot. In fact, From Russia with Love was meant to be the death of 007. It concludes on a very much final note, with Bond falling victim to a poisoned blade hidden within the shoes of senior Smersh officer Rosa Klebb. However, Fleming was ultimately persuaded to continue the series, and Dr. No was written with an explanation of how Bond survived and the long treatment at the hands of service neurologist and psychologist Sir James Maloney. The ordeal did clearly take a toll on Bond, but what was meant to be a rest cure turned into quite the adventure, a point Bond sarcastically notes in a message to M at the end of the book. It was also around this time that Fleming received a letter from Geoffrey Boothroyd, a small arms expert, who provided information on better firearms for Bond to use. This is where 007 picks up the Walther PPK, and the character of Major Boothroyd, who in the films would be better known as Q, originated. After writing Goldfinger, published in 1959, Fleming tried something different. Film options were again being discussed in the background, and some not even connected to the Bond series, but the next James Bond adventure was actually a group of smaller stories. For Your Eyes Only compiles 5 short stories, 2 of which, the titular story and Risiko, which focuses on the feud between Columbo and Christatos, would serve as the basis for the eventual film. The Hildebrand Rarity would have some of its elements adapted into License to Kill, while only the titles of From a View to a Kill and Quantum of Solace would be worked into the movies. It is important to note the film options popping up because Thunderball was actually the result of unused film scripts and various film treatments being turned into a Bond novel. Ian didn't deny that he borrowed a number of elements of these film treatments, but claimed that a number of aspects were his. Behind the scenes, Fleming had been working with Kevin McClory and Jack Whittingham on a number of ideas for a movie. The general theme throughout these, the theft of nuclear weapons, was kept as Thunderball's main plot. Interestingly, it is believed that Thunderball may be the first notable occasion where the classic hijack some nuclear warheads and hold the world to ransom scheme was introduced. You can essentially argue, perhaps not a necessarily happy argument, but the James Bond series was essentially the debut of nuclear terrorism. We've had a number of plots like that, but prior to this, anything involving nuclear weapons was usually World War III or something like Godzilla. In this case, it's just something that's become a cliche, but there you go. The movie ideas didn't get off the ground. They were bandied around and took on fairly familiar forms that we'd recognise in Thunderball. Fleming turned them into the book and ultimately triggered a massive lawsuit from McClory and Whittingham, most notably the quite litigious McClory. It's quite a long and complex story, admittedly, but it was generally a huge argument over intellectual property and who owned what. The result of it is that Thunderball, whether in film or in book form, has the note that it is based on a screen treatment by Ian Fleming, Kevin McClory, and Jack Whittingham. The end result of the broader legal battles taking place over many years was that McClory would retain the rights to the Thunderball concept, which was settled in 1963 but did not prevent the film from being developed and released. Worth noting, it did include that disclaimer that it was based on the screen treatment. And eventually the Spectre organisation, which had evolved from those film scripts. Fleming originally claimed this was his idea, but it was ultimately attributed to McClory. These elements would eventually return to the Bond franchise after McClory's death, allowing Spectre to reappear in the Craig continuity, though a few jabs at McClory were included in For Your Eyes Only, the movie. The very stressful legal action would actually have a severe impact on Ian's health, most likely contributing in some way to the heart attack he suffered in 1961 and dragging his health down again in 1963. Of course, Fleming living the sort of lifestyle his hero lived probably didn't help. At least 1961 had some good news, in the revelation From Russia with Love was apparently one of President John F. Kennedy's favourite books, and it was the beginning of the cinematic 007 franchise. The next book after Thunderball, The Spy Who Loved Me, is an experimental piece. It is written from the perspective of a young woman named Vivienne Michel, and tells the story of her life up to the time she is menaced at a motel where she works by two vicious gangsters who were apparently there to commit some sort of insurance fraud scheme. Thankfully for our heroine, circumstances conspire to bring James Bond on the scene. It is implied he has been spending time in America after Operation Thunderball, and he helps her thwart their sinister plans. The book is admittedly rather misogynistic in some of its attitudes, like, let's be honest, there was a fair bit of misogyny in that time, and this one is pretty rough. Fleming ultimately decided only the title could be used, being rather ashamed of it. The unusual experiment probably can be seen in a slightly brighter light these days, just as something different, but the attitudes are definitely not very good. It is still worth a read for curiosity's sake, though. Bond would tangle with Spectre again in On Her Majesty's Secret Service, the story where he finally gets married only for everything to be cruelly snatched away by a vengeful Blofeld. This story was actually incredibly successful. It had one of the biggest advances of any of the Bond novels and was very well regarded. It's no surprise that over time it became one of the best loved films, even if it did take a while to get there. Ironically, Bond's prediction that his marriage wouldn't last and he'd get himself sent to Japan or somewhere back in Diamonds Are Forever would come true, but fortunes were getting a little bit better for his writer, especially after Fleming did undertake a trip to Japan. 1962 saw the release of Dr. No, the first James Bond film. Visiting the set and seeing Sean Connery's work as Bond appears to have been the inspiration for Fleming's decision to give James Bond Scottish ancestry on his father's side. He's Swiss on his mother's side through Monique Delacroix. After all, what better time to introduce some family history for Bond than in a book where genealogy features as a plot point? In fact, it's theorised that he's connected to a more famous Bond family. Fleming's research once again had a chance to shine, and by this time, it had even shone in two non-fiction books, Thrilling Cities and The Diamond Smugglers. He had also worked on what would become a popular children's story for his son Caspar, Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, about a flying car. Interestingly, when that was made into the movie, Gert Frobe, who played Auric Goldfinger, would be the villain in that. Even amid his turbulent social life, which seemed to resist attempts to slow down, Fleming continued to write and refine his stories. While his life did achieve a sense of balance in the days after his first heart attack, the renewed pressure of Kevin McClory's legal actions, coupled with the fact he had physically damaged his heart and couldn't quite leave that luxurious lifestyle behind, ultimately would send Ian Fleming's health into a terminal decline. His death on August 11th, 1964, sadly his son's 12th birthday, left a great number of matters to sort in his estate due to the number of projects and properties he had, such as Glidrose Productions, which were involved in publishing his books. He also left the unrefined manuscript of The Man with the Golden Gun, and 3 short stories, Octopussy, Property of a Lady, and The Living Daylights. They were collected into a short story collection much like For Your Eyes Only. Fleming's death actually meant he narrowly missed the development of James Bond into a full-fledged pop culture phenomenon with the release of Goldfinger at the cinemas. Ian Fleming's life contributed many details to the world of the literary Bond. In some ways, Bond was the spy Fleming might have wanted to be, though he did see some action in the field. He was ultimately not a field agent due to his extremely valuable role in the service, as opposed to a lack of physical capacity. He very much lived like 007, though Bond would somehow manage to outlive his creator despite the quantity of alcohol and cigarettes consumed, especially if what we read in Thunderball is anything to go by. Yet while Fleming had a knack for self-deprecation, we never actually learned Bond's birthday, yet Fleming would bestow his own birthday of May 28, 1908 upon arch-villain and Spectre boss Ernst Stavro Blofeld. The fact remains, Ian Fleming changed the world of spy literature, and later the world of cinema via the movies his books inspired, forever. It is perhaps impossible, or at the very least, very difficult to imagine a world without James Bond and his many imitators. Bond has survived changing times, geopolitical upheaval, revolutions in the world of intelligence, and many supervillains with sinister ambitions. When the world seems tough, we can sit back and enjoy a thrilling tale of good versus evil, of wonderfully described locations, lavish meals which were important at the time. Britain was in a pretty rough place with its post-war austerity, and of course many beautiful women. There is no doubt Ian was a skilled non-fiction writer. In creating James Bond, he truly left his mark upon the world. The books may well be products of their time, so there are going to be some problematic elements, but I urge you to seek them out and read from where it all began. Perhaps fittingly, I shall end at the beginning, the very first line of the entire franchise. The scent and smoke and sweat of a casino are nauseating at 3 in the morning. Okay, so the lesson ran a little bit short, but here's a fact I actually forgot to put in. Ian Fleming was actually a distant cousin of Sir Christopher Lee. The two of them worked as part of SOE during World War II, which interestingly enough actually included John Pertwee, and it was very appropriate that Christopher Lee would go on to play Francisco Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun, where he portrayed a very refined version of Scaramanga compared to the thuggish character in the book. So, just a little bit of extra information that makes the world feel a little bit smaller in some ways. Alright, so we've actually unlocked a cheat code. You can get to multiplayer, which I'm not going to cover yet, but our cheat options. Scroll down to this menu and you'll see we've unlocked paintball mode. I'll give you a quick demonstration of that now that I've provided all the information and died a few times. Note that you can only complete missions you've already beaten when you're using cheats, because, well, some of them would just make things really hard, or really easy. It'd make it way too easy to complete things. So, paintball mode is, well, it's kind of what you'd expect. Assuming I don't miss my shot, splotches of paint will appear when you shoot. It's just a little bit of fun, really, and if you hit an enemy's gun, as you can see there, you'll get very bright splotches of paint on them. Excuse me, sir, where are you? You, with the bowl cut. I am trying to talk to people. Now, you can shoot enemies' guns and knock them flying around, but as you can see, a nicely timed shot will put paint on things. So that's pretty much what it does. It's nothing fancy, it doesn't really do a lot, but that's just it, really. It's a good little bit of fun which crowns nicely a few other fun cheats in the game. See, where are you? It does just brighten up these drab concrete Soviet installations a bit, doesn't it? They really were a bit boring with all that concrete. It's not fantastic, but Oh well. We'll just wrap up the mission by going for another jump. I do apologize that I got myself shot a few times, but that gauntlet in the bottom of the dam is really difficult if you've taken a few hits, because you've got to work out where the enemies are, and my memory is a bit spotty on that, and avoid being hit. Now, if I can just wipe out these guys... Ah yes, the unnecessary combat roll. It doesn't help that I don't really feel... Like, as I've said several times on other games, the control stick is too responsive and doesn't do subtle movement very well. If I'm careful... There we go. Yeah, I do think that the control stick is a bit fiddly on the newer controllers. The N64 wasn't quite as responsive, but that made it a lot better for subtle movements. There we go. Now, it's also worth noting that the guards' faces will only wind up loading about, well, a small handful, about 5 or 6. And they're based on the developers as well. So you might notice a certain favourite scientist, for example, doing a side job with the Russian army or working for other villainous organisations throughout. All part of how it goes. It's just a little bit of fun having them based on the developers. It just adds a bit of character to the game. Now, if you've got the sniper rifle, you can zoom in all the way over there and you can actually see another island with what appears to be a drone gun of some kind on it. Originally, you were supposed to take a boat over there, which is why that wharf is down there. But they decided not to worry about that. It's cut content and there's no way, as far as I know, to reach it. Well, somebody's shooting at us. Let's get out of here. That nicely wraps up the first mission. We've already seen me shoot like a stormtrooper, so the odds are not going to be good, but it's mostly informative with me screaming and flailing around and missing absolutely everything in the background. Thank you very much for joining me. Until next time, this is Red 2, returning to base.